What's up, creepers? I'm Kevin, and this is Haunted by Horror. I think most of us are familiar with what mockbusters are. For anyone who's not, they are low-budget, quickly produced films that attempt to capitalize on the success of a popular film or franchise with a similar title and plot. A lot of times these will be picked up by your aunt or uncle who knows that you like Transformers or Pacific Rim, and so they decide to get you Transmorphers or Atlantic Rim. And then, of course, there are masochists like myself who are interested in seeing what a Star Wars movie might look like if it was made from a script written over the weekend and produced for the equivalent of a quarter of its catering budget. But today, we're talking about the reverse. Big budget movies that ripped off low budget movies. Now, in this video, I use the term ripped off very loosely, and it doesn't necessarily mean that these movies were outright plagiarized. I'm just talking about movies that have a very clear similarity to a previously released work, whether that's because of parallel thinking, over-reliance on genre tropes, or actually copying someone else's homework. And so with that in mind, this is my list of 7 blockbusters that ripped off B-movie horror. Number 7, Saw, 2006, Den, 2001. Saw is a film that has proven to be very influential in the horror genre. It spawned a franchise that spans 9 films to date, inspired countless imitators, and established the foundation for a new subgenre known as torture porn. And while that term has a lot of stigma attached to it, and many of the Saw sequels and other films in the category focus on gore over coherent plot, the first Saw film is actually an interesting thriller with far less gore than you would expect given the nomenclature. But was it original, or was it, as some have claimed, a remake of the independent film Den? Saw is about a serial killer known as Jigsaw who captures his victims and uses Rube Goldberg-esque devices to force them into deadly games in which they must inflict severe bodily injury upon themselves or others in order to prove their will to live and seek absolution for past sin. Den is about a serial killer and religious zealot who kidnaps and tortures 4 people over a 9-day period. He leaves them locked away in a room where he visits each day to argue and debate with his detainees. It's revealed through the course of the film that they are not only bound with chains, but also to each other through personal secrets that start to come out as the story progresses and the bodies pile up. This was probably the easiest example to research for this video, as the producer/writer/director/star of Den, Greg Arce, has been very outspoken about the fact that he believes the writers of Saw essentially remade his film. He's done numerous interviews in which he states as much, and has even compiled a list of 17 points of similarity between the two films that he repeats almost verbatim in every interview. This is his list. Number 1. The overall idea of a serial killer who puts one victim against the other so that they kill each other. Number 2. Hidden secrets that each victim has that tie them to one another. Number 3. One of the main characters is a doctor in Saw, and in Den, one of the main characters is a psychotherapist. Number 4. In both films, the characters have a secret that deals with infidelity. Number 5. The idea that the killer must have been either watching or collecting information on the victims' lives to know so much about them. Number 6. The main scene that wraps the whole movie is of 2 victims chained up so that they can't reach each other. Plus, although Saw is an old bathroom and Den is an old theater, the look of the walls, pipes, and chains looks a lot like ours. Number 7. These are the 2 loglines from the films. See how interchangeable they are? Den logline. A madman with a religious secret captures his future victims and plays a deadly game of Q&A. No one comes out alive from this rec room where truth, sins, and religious faith are questioned and scarred for life. Saw logline. Saw follows a madman who, obsessed with teaching his victims the value of life, abducts morally wayward people and forces them to play horrific games for their own survival. Faced with impossible choices, each victim must struggle to win back his or her life, or else die trying. Number 8. The main story of Saw has 2 men tied in chains who wake up in a strange place. In Den, the captives also wake up in a strange place and are tied with chains. Number 9. In Den, the killer picks people he believes to have some immoral secret or past and the same is true of the killer in Saw. Number 10. In Den, the killer plays psychological games that pit each captive against each other. The same is true in Saw. Number 11. In Den, the killer tries to make the captives make decisions that will require someone else to die. The same is true in Saw. Number 12. There's a key scene in Saw where the killer says, "Make a choice," and this line is used in the trailer. We have a similar scene in Den where the line is repeated over and over. Number 13. We have a tub of water next to one of our captives in Den. In Saw, there is a bathtub next to one of the captives. Number 14. The opening scene in Saw where the captives wake up is very similar to the one in Den where they're asking each other where they are and what the situation is all about. Number 15. Both films have scenes showing how the captives were picked up by the killer. Number 16. In Saw, one of the characters talks about himself as being on a leash due to the chain. We have the same speech in Den. Number 17. We have two types of posters for Den, and in one, the character shown is very similar to the killer's doll that talks to the captives in Saw. Plus, some have said that the doll looks similar to the look of the killer at the end of Den. There are certainly similarities between Den and Saw. There could be no denial that they share several common elements and even similar plot points, and the face on the poster of Den does look a bit like the Billy puppet from Saw. But whether or not James Wan and Leigh Whannell took inspiration from Den in making Saw is difficult to determine. They certainly didn't remake Den as Ars has claimed. There are actually more than a few differences between the two films, and some of his comparisons are more convincing than others. For instance, a surgeon and a psychotherapist are obviously not the same thing. Having one victim chained near a bathtub in a bathroom doesn't seem quite equivalent to having a toad of water in the room with the victims, and they're both utilized in very different ways in the plot. The idea that in both films, the characters wake up in a strange place and are chained down, and that both films end with two victims chained so they can't reach each other, is essentially the same point, and like some of the other more general points, is a common trope in kidnapping and abduction movies, such as the idea that the killer was collecting information on the victims before he kidnapped them, or that it shows a scene where he kidnaps the victims. These points to me just seem incredibly weak. There is, however, one point that Ars constantly brings up that seems like it could potentially strengthen the argument for inspiration, and that is the fact that James Wan and Leigh Whannell were both film students in Melbourne when Den played at the Melbourne Underground Film Festival, and their film received quite a bit of attention and praise at that particular festival, with the lead actress even winning an award for Best Actress at the festival. Film students do generally like to go to local film festivals, and it is feasible that they attended a screening of the film while it was playing there. There's no concrete evidence that they did, but it is possible. Ars has attempted in the past to obtain evidence of their attendance, going so far as to ask the festival for assistance in doing so, but according to him, representatives from the festival flat out refused to intervene. Again, there are several similarities between the two films, and it is entirely possible that the filmmakers behind Saw were inspired by Den, but the evidence isn't exactly damning. Greg Ars has threatened several times to bring suit against James Wan, Leigh Whannell, and Lionsgate, but nothing has ever come of it, and at this point it seems unlikely that anything ever will. However, Den is available to watch for free on YouTube, and you can easily watch it and judge for yourself.
I love you, Bob.
Number 6. The Blair Witch Project, 1999. The Last Broadcast, 1998. This example actually ties into the last one, as Greg Ars has often cited it when attempting to make his own case against the Saw film, and the Blair Witch Project has been cited by James Wan and Leigh Whannell as an inspiration for them to attempt to write and fund their own film. A lot of horror fans will probably remember this controversy from when these accusations initially came to light, but since that was in 1999, there are probably some who aren't even aware that it was ever a thing. The Last Broadcast is a mockumentary film that investigates an incident known as the Jersey Devil murders, in which members of the cast and crew of a local cable access show were brutally butchered while filming in the Pine Barrens. Jim Seward, who initially led the group out to the area where they were murdered, using his supposed psychic powers, was the only survivor. He was subsequently convicted of the murders and died in prison under mysterious circumstances. Documentary filmmaker David Lee does not believe that Seward was responsible, and his documentary sets out to explore who or what may have actually been behind the Jersey Devil murders. The Blair Witch Project is a found-footage film that tells the story of 3 film students who travel to a small town to collect documentary footage about the local legend of the Blair Witch. Over the course of several days, the students interview townspeople and gather clues to support the tale's veracity. But the project takes a frightening turn when the students lose their way in the woods and begin to experience strange occurrences. While there are a lot of similarities between these 2 films, and the last broadcast was released a year before Blair Witch, it's been fairly substantially proven at this point that the 2 films were developed independently of one another, that Blair Witch is not inspired or influenced by the last broadcast, and that it's merely a case of parallel thinking. It's also been demonstrated that it's highly unlikely that the creators of the Blair Witch Project could have seen the last broadcast or known of its existence when they began developing their own project. So, where did this rumor come from? Well, it originated with an interview with the filmmakers of the last broadcast, Stefan Avalos and Lance Wheeler, in the Philadelphia Daily News on September 6, 1999, in which they discussed the similarities between the Blair Witch Project and the last broadcast. The press latched onto the story and implied that the Blair Witch was a ripoff of broadcast, which caused a snowball effect, with an E! Entertainment News report going so far as to state that the filmmakers of the last broadcast were outraged and implying that they might soon seek litigation. In the original article, they did express their disappointment that the Blair Witch was being lauded as an extremely original and even genre-redefining film, when many of the elements that people were praising about Blair Witch were things that they had done previously in the last broadcast. But Avalos and Wheeler never actually threatened legal action, nor did they claim that the filmmakers of Blair Witch had directly stolen or copied their idea, merely that it wasn't as unique or groundbreaking as many reviewers claimed. Both movies used video instead of film and are presented in a pseudo-documentary format. Both heavily rely on supposedly found footage filmed by the characters within the story, and both take place largely in the woods. One of the main differences between the 2 films is the perspective from which the story is told. Broadcast follows a more standard mockumentary format, which more heavily utilizes interviews and portrays the narrative from the point of view of a documentary filmmaker, whereas Blair Witch is more first-person driven and less detached. Blair Witch is eerier and more frightening throughout, whereas broadcast doesn't get really chilling until the end when the final revelation is revealed. In many ways, the last broadcast is a better film overall, and is more impressive for having been made for a budget of only $900, compared to the Blair Witch's budget of $60,000, which, to be clear, is still considered low budget, but it's also 66.6 times that of the last broadcast. While the Blair Witch Project may not have been directly inspired by the last broadcast, I do hope that this video inspires those of you who haven't seen the last broadcast to give it a shot. While the acting in the film isn't the most convincing, it's still an excellent example of what was possible at the time on a micro budget. And it kind of makes you question what exactly the Blair Witch Project spent so much money on. And personally, I think the last broadcast is a better movie.
It's the 21st century. Shilong.
Number 5. Repo Men, 2010. Repo, the Genetic Opera, 2008. The film Repo, the Genetic Opera features a dystopian future where the megacorporation GeneCo provides loans to people in need of organ transplants, and then sends repo men after those organs should they miss their payments. It was originally based on a stage production titled The Necromancer's Debt, which Darren Smith and Terence Sadunich wrote in 1999. It was first performed as a 10-minute stage opera about a grave robber who falls in debt with an organ repo man. But due to its success with audiences, the 2 writers worked over the next 2 years to flesh it out into a longer format. The film Repo Men also told the story of a dystopian future where the megacorporation, the Union, would finance organs and send repo men out to reclaim them when the recipients missed their payments. It was based on the book The Repossession Mambo by Eric Garcia, which was published in 2009. This example is different from the previous ones on the list, as it was fans rather than the filmmakers who alleged plagiarism. When trailers for Repo Men came out, several fans of Repo the Genetic Opera noticed similarities and began to post online about the parallels between the two films, raising questions about whether or not Repo Men was an original work. Though the novel The Repossession Mambo was published in 2009, Garcia had previously written an unpublished 13-page story by the same name that served as the basis for the novel, which was circulated as early as 1997. Once this was revealed, some people questioned if there was plagiarism in the opposite direction. However, the creators of Repo the Genetic Opera would not have had access to this story prior to 2009 when the novel was published. Before Repo Men came out in theaters, the director of Repo the Genetic Opera, Darren Lynn Bousman, who also directed Saw 2, 3, 4, and Spiral, expressed his displeasure that Repo Men was created, stating that he did feel that they had stolen their premise, but that he felt that it would help draw more attention to their film, and the creators on both sides have worked hard to assure audience that neither film plagiarized the other. There are some interesting similarities between Repo the Genetic Opera and Repo Men. They both involve organ repossession and refer to organ recovery agents as repo men. They both contain cheesy commercials selling organs. They both involve a giant soulless corporation that literally kills people to serve their bottom line. They both use barcodes on organ recipients which are scanned by the repo men, and they also both feature a strong, addictive painkiller that glows. In Repo the Genetic Opera, it's Zydrate, which comes in a little glass vial.
A little glass vial?
A little glass vial. And is a blue glowing liquid. Whereas in Repo Men, it's Q, which is a glowing red powder. However, the two films, despite their similarities, are actually very different. The most obvious difference being that Repo the Genetic Opera is, of course, a rock opera, while Repo Man is an action film. But aside from that, the plots of the two films deviate from one another in fairly substantial ways. They each have very different characters, events in the two films are distinct from one another, and they do not share a common setting. Conceptually, they're very similar, but they both take that concept in very different directions. In a way, it's like a creative writing exercise where everyone is given a one-sentence writing prompt, and then everyone creates a different story based on that prompt. Overall, it seems like it was just a case of very creative people coming up with similar concepts. But it is interesting to watch both films to see the similarities, but also to explore the different approaches that each took in working with such a similar concept. Number 4, Alien, 1979, Planet of the Vampires, 1964, It, The Terror from Space, 1958. This entry is probably one of the most interesting on this list. Alien is a sci-fi horror film that has achieved what very few sci-fi or horror films ever do: prestige within the film industry. It was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry in 2002. It won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects and was also nominated for Best Art Direction. It also won 2 BAFTAs for Best Production Design and Best Soundtrack, and was nominated for 5 more: Best Supporting Actor for Hurt, Best Costume Design for Molo, Best Editing for Rawling, Most Promising Newcomer in a Leading Role for Weaver, and the Anthony Aquin Award for Original Film Music for Goldsmith. It also won 3 Saturn Awards: Best Science Fiction Film, Best Direction for Scott, and Best Supporting Actress for Cartwright, and was nominated for 4 more: Best Actress for Weaver, Best Makeup for Hay, Best Special Effects for Johnson and Alder, and Best Writing for O'Bannon. And in 2008, it was ranked as the 7th best science fiction film ever made by the American Film Institute. H.R. Giger's designs are incredible. The cinematography is impressive, and the tension within the film is palpable with a foreboding air of haunting mystery, helped along by the outstanding score by composer Jerry Goldsmith. despite the fact that he has publicly voiced his disapproval with the way that Scott and Rawlings cut up and pasted his score piecemeal into the film rather than using it as he intended. But there is a lingering question, which is probably fairly obvious given the theme of this video. Just how original was Alien? Despite its numerous accolades and unquestionable cultural impact, there are some who claim that Alien is nothing more than a ripoff of not one, but two different movies. Though producer David Giller has spoken out in defense of Alien, stating in an interview with Glenn Lovell of the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel that these similarities come down to the fact that the premise of an alien stowing away in a ship and then killing off its crew one by one is pretty much a classic premise of science fiction writers, like the gunfight in the Western. In other words, yes, it's just a flashy retread of a number of low-budget 1950s creature features, but not of any one specifically, and not in a litigious way. But is it really as simple as that, or is there more to the story? Alien tells the story of the crew of the commercial starship Nostromo, who are awakened from their cryosleep chambers by Mother, their ship's computer, halfway through their journey home to investigate a distress call from an alien moon, per company policy. While investigating the source of the distress call, an alien ship, the crew encounters a nest of eggs and soon find themselves up against an aggressive and deadly extraterrestrial set loose on the Nostromo. It, Terror from Space, focuses on the crew of a rescue team that is sent to fetch Colonel Edward Carruthers, the lone survivor of the first manned flight to Mars. Though he's slated for the firing squad after ostensibly killing his entire crew, he insists that a Martian monster is to blame for the death. Commander Van Housen and the team doubt Carruthers' claims until more mysterious killings occur. To their horror, they realize that the bloodthirsty beast is on board the ship. The plots of Terror from Space and Alien are very similar. The basic setup is identical, and there are also several specific plot points that are shared between the two films. There are, however, a few minor differences. The first difference is that in it, the crew investigates the surface of the planet because it's their entire mission to discover the fate of the Challenge 141 and its crew, whereas in Alien, they only investigate because they receive a distress call. Another difference is that in it, they discover a single survivor of the crash who is initially suspected of having killed the rest of the crew in order to conserve rations while awaiting rescue. Both films are about a small group of people trapped aboard a spacecraft with a hostile creature who begins to pick them off one by one. In both Alien and it, the alien evades detection by traveling through the ship's ventilation shafts. In both films, it's warded off by a crew member with a blowtorch, and in both films, the creature is finally defeated by being ejected into deep space through the airlock. Though in it, the creature suffocates and finally expires. While in Alien, the creature pops up for one final scare, able to survive the vacuum of space, and is then incinerated by the thrusters from the escape pod. And this slight difference in endings highlights some of the key differences between the two films. The main difference is that Alien had a much higher budget. The shapes of the two creatures are also very different, with the creature in it being a humanoid creature with reptilian features, whereas Alien employs H.R. Giger's much more menacing insectoid creature design. Alien also utilizes much more sophisticated practical effects and has much more elaborate sets, but a lot of that is simply due to having a much higher budget. In Planet of the Vampires, two spaceships, the Argos and the Galliot, are sent to investigate the mysterious planet Aura. As the Galliot lands on the planet, her crew suddenly goes berserk and starts to attack each other. The strange event passes, But the crew soon discovers the crashed Argos and learns that her crew died fighting each other. Investigating further, the explorers come to realize the existence of a race of bodiless aliens that seek to escape from their dying world. Some have claimed that Alien derives its plot from It, the creature from beyond space, and its visual style from Planet of the Vampires, but the plots of Alien and Planet of the Vampires are also very similar. Some of the parallels between Planet of the Vampires and Alien are very general, but there's also extremely specific imagery shared between films. They're both very similar in overall atmosphere and design. Both films take place on planets that are shrouded in fog with strange otherworldly rock formations protruding threateningly in the distance. They both revolve around a space crew who receives a distress call from a crashed ship. While investigating the wreckage, they discover the remains of a colossal humanoid, and soon after, a race of parasitic aliens begin to wreak havoc, causing the crew to feud with each other as they are slowly picked off one by one. There are a few very specific images that are shared between both films. In Planet of the Vampires, we see, from the perspective of the crew of the Galliot, the Argos sitting ominously on a cliff overlooking the vast alien landscape. And this scene is replicated nearly identically in Alien, when the crew of the Nostromo first discovers the derelict craft sitting on a cliff in a similar manner. Looking at these two shots side by side, it's difficult to deny that there is a striking similarity. Another is the scene in Alien where, while exploring the derelict vessel, the crew wanders down long corridors and climbs a large platform to discover a giant humanoid figure in the pilot seat that has been fossilized. This directly mirrors a scene in Planet of the Vampires where the crew, while exploring the derelict ship, wanders down long corridors and discovers giant humanoid skeletons. Both of the films employ constant camera movement to help build suspense, which is a common filmmaking technique, but there are shot compositions and even entire sequences that are mirrored between the two films, and this, combined with the other visual elements that are strikingly similar, make it difficult to believe that Planet of the Vampires didn't have at least some influence on the visual style of Alien. Number 3. Aliens, 1986. Galaxy of Terror, 1981. Yes, that's right. The next movie on our list is Aliens, the sequel to Alien. After Alien was released, there were countless low-budget copycat movies produced in an attempt to capitalize on its success. One of those films happened to be Roger Corman's 1981 film, Galaxy of Terror. Roger Corman is well known for creating low-budget independent films based on other existing films that were financially successful, and Galaxy of Terror was Corman's answer to Alien. There's no question that it was created as essentially an Alien ripoff movie, but it's a very well-made ripoff with a lot of interesting visuals that heavily influenced the legitimate sequel to Alien, Aliens. The plot of Aliens focuses on Ellen Ripley, the sole human survivor, let's not forget about Jonesy, the cat, of the alien attack in the first film. After floating in space for 57 years, Ripley's shuttle is found by a deep space salvage team. After some time coming to terms with everything that's happened, Ripley settles into her new life working aboard Gateway Station. The moon where the crew of the Nostromo encountered the alien creature in the first film is now a terraforming colony called Hadley's Hope, and when communication with the colony is lost, Ripley is asked to accompany a team of colonial Marines to investigate. But even the troop of battle-hardened Marines, with all their futuristic weaponry, are no match for the hordes of aliens that have invaded the colony, led by the giant alien queen. The plot of Galaxy of Terror involves the crew of the spaceship Quest. They're sent on a rescue mission to the planet Morganthus in search of a ship that has disappeared. Quest is forced to make a controlled crash landing on the surface, after which they head out onto the surface in search of survivors from the other ship. They discover that there's a giant structure that seems to be the source of the energy that caused their ship to crash, and most of the crew set out to explore it. The crew members begin to experience a growing sense of dread, and one by one are attacked by creatures that seem to be a manifestation of their most basic primal fears. A large part of the reason that Galaxy of Terror was so influential to Aliens was that the production designer and second unit director on Galaxy of Terror was also the director of Aliens, James Cameron. Cameron would take several elements from Galaxy of Terror and incorporate them into Aliens. The use of similar matte paintings and miniatures, the design for the surface of the planet, and the light rigs and the backpacks were all taken directly from Galaxy of Terror. The look of the inside of the colony in Aliens is also incredibly reminiscent of the inside of the pyramid from Galaxy of Terror, but they're both clearly influenced by H.R. Giger's work on the original Alien film, so it's kind of a moot point. The fact that both crews enter into a mysteriously vacant installation and use a flamethrower to torch the first body that they come across is something that's also shared between both films, and even the design for the alien queen was only possible because of the giant maggot in Galaxy of Terror, as the crane that they designed for use with the giant maggot was the foundation of the device that they used to control the alien queen. Most of the similarities between these two films come down to the visuals and the techniques employed by Cameron across films. The actual plots of the two films are fairly different, with the exception of a couple of scenes that have been ported over, though there is another big-budget movie that does have a similar plot to Galaxy of Terror, that film being Event Horizon. It shares a similar atmosphere and basic setup, though it takes quite a different approach to the concept of manifesting primal fears. However, the influence of Galaxy of Terror on Aliens and on the future of the Alien franchise cannot be understated. There are certain elements of Aliens that are absolutely ripped off of Galaxy of Terror. Without Galaxy of Terror, there would undoubtedly be a sequel to Alien, but it almost definitely would not be anything like the James Cameron helmed classic, Aliens. Number 2, Home Alone, 1990, Deadly Games, 1989. It's not often that a family comedy rips off a horror film, but Home Alone may be the exception. When Home Alone came out in 1990, it captured the attention of viewers with a comedic take on the home invasion theme that's common in horror films. It was a seemingly unique take on a tried and true formula, but as it turns out, Kevin McAllister was not the first kid to be left home alone and forced to defend himself with elaborate booby traps against an intruder during Christmas time. A year and a half before Home Alone was released, mulleted badass Thomas de Fremont had already fought for his life against a sadistic Santa Claus in the French horror thriller Deadly Games, which is also known by the titles Dial Code Santa Claus, Game Over, and Hide and Freak. Home Alone is about an 8-year-old named Kevin McAllister. When Kevin acts out the night before a family trip to Paris, his mother makes him sleep in the attic. His family mistakenly leave for the airport without him, and he wakes up to an empty house and assumes his wish for his family to disappear has come true. But his initial excitement soon fades, and when he realizes that 2 burglars are planning to rob their house, he must defend himself and their home from the intruders. In Deadly Games, Thomas is obsessed with action movies and video games, and enjoys turning the mansion in which he lives with his mother and grandfather into an improvised battleground by setting up elaborate booby traps and makeshift weaponry. When a vagrant dressed as Santa breaks into the house through the chimney, Thomas must use the skills he has learned through hour upon hour of rewatching Rambo movies, along with security cameras and his arsenal of improvised weaponry and booby traps, to fight back and protect himself and his enfeebled grandfather from the murderous Saint Nick. Both films feature a lot of violence, but the difference is in how the violence is portrayed and who the violence is inflicted upon. Unlike Kevin McAllister, Thomas faces actual danger. In Deadly Games, the violence is treated in much the same way that it would be in a slasher film, and innocent people are murdered. In Home Alone, the bandits survive several booby traps that in the real world would have definitely killed them. The Wet Bandits and Santa are similar in some ways. In both films, they're bumbling, almost cartoonishly over-the-top villains who become more and more angry and disheveled throughout the course of the film due to the various booby traps and improvised anti-personnel devices that they encounter. Parallels can also be drawn between the mothers in the two films, and even the grandfather in Deadly Games and the South Bend Shovel Slayer in Home Alone share some similarities, specifically towards the end of each film, but most of the parallels between the two films come down to the two main protagonists, Thomas and Kevin. They're both intelligent, outspoken, resourceful, and self-reliant boys whose approach to dealing with a situation in which they are forced to face off against grown men who want to harm them is very much the same. They're able to fight back by outsmarting them and using Rube Goldberg-esque contraptions made of toys and other household items. Their personalities are also similar in some ways, though Thomas does seem tougher, which makes sense given the higher stakes of the film. Both characters display a certain naivete that serves to reiterate that they are in fact young children who aren't emotionally prepared to deal with the dangerous situations which they are faced with. This is shown primarily through Thomas's absolute belief that the sadistic killer truly is Santa Claus and has come to punish him, and through Kevin's fear of the basement furnace and the belief that it was his wish that made his family disappear. There are several differences between the two films, but the plots and even specific events in the films are very similar. The main setting is essentially the same, and the characters of Thomas and Kevin are very comparable. The director of Deadly Games, Renee Manzer, at one point threatened legal action on the grounds of plagiarism, alleging that they had remade my movie. Though nothing ever came of it, and since we're talking about two films that came out over 30 years ago, it's doubtful at this point that anything will.
Starkweather 2 Delta. Your time has come. You're moving out to the island.
Number 1, The Island, 2005. Parts, The Clonus Horror, 1979. This one is probably the most blatant ripoff on this list. The film The Island came out in 2005, and many people, especially fans of Mystery Science Theater 3000, immediately noticed similarities to another film, Parts, The Clonus Horror, as soon as the trailer came out. Clonus is about a character named Richard, one of many people living in an isolated compound. The people in the colony spend most of their time exercising and believe that the outside world is contaminated. But when they are ready, they will be sent to a place called America, where the environment is clean and they will live happy lives. Richard soon discovers that he and the others are actually clones who were raised in secret to be harvested for their body parts to ensure that rich people who have paid for the service can live longer lives. Richard tells his girlfriend Lena about his discovery, escapes the facility without her, and sets out for Southern California to tell the outside world about what is going on. The Island is about a character named Lincoln, one of many people living in an isolated compound. The people in the colony spend most of their time exercising and believe that the outside world is contaminated. But if they win the lottery, they will be sent to a place called the Island, where the environment is clean and they will live happy lives. Lincoln soon discovers that he and the others are actually clones who were raised in secret to be harvested for their body parts to ensure that rich people who have paid for the service can live longer lives. Lincoln tells his friend Jordan about his discovery, escapes the facility with her, and sets out for Southern California to tell the outside world about what is going on. The Island was produced by DreamWorks, which was sued by the makers of Parts, The Clonus Horror for stealing the plot. From specific characters to dialogues and the direction of the two films, many similarities can be seen. The court found that there were 103 points of similarity between the two films, and ruled that it could proceed to trial, but it never did. According to a 2007 interview with Clonus screenwriter Bob Sullivan, DreamWorks and Clonus Associates reached a settlement, the specific terms of which are sealed, but, according to Sullivan, the amount settled for was in the seven-figure range. As similar as they are, there are a few differences between the two films, the most significant difference being the ending of the two films. I won't spoil the ending of either film here, but I will say that the ending of Clonus makes more sense within the context of the story. However, the ending of The Island seems more fitting for a big-budget summer blockbuster directed by Michael Bay. Another thing that's different between the two films is actually an additional use for the female clones in The Island. In The Island, they harvest clones for organs in the same way that they do in Clonus. However, they also use female clones to birth children for wealthy women. They are in a cloning facility. Why would they need to do this? Why couldn't they just use the pods that they're clearly demonstrated using to gestate the clones to instead gestate the fetuses. It doesn't make any sense, and it's bothered me since I watched the film. The island had a budget of $124 million, almost 345 times the budget of Clonus, which was $350,000. So Nate W., who wrote a review of Clonus back in 2000 on IMDb, and stated that he wished he could see a Clonus remake with a big Hollywood budget.
You still think there's an island?
Well, that's the end of my list. If you like this video, can you please hit the little like button? If you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to be updated whenever I upload a new video. Thank you for watching this, and keep on creeping on.